In 2005 and 2006, documentary filmmaker Paul Kimball polled a select group of the world's leading UFO researchers. He asked each for a list of their 10 best UFO cases of all time. The cases were assigned point values, then averaged together. Over 70 UFO incidents from around the world received votes. At the end of the process, the following 10 incidents comprised the best evidence UFO cases of all time. Though unidentified flying objects first gained a place in modern culture with Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947, and the thousands upon thousands of sightings ever since, the phenomenon itself was known long before that, from reports of airships in the late 19th century all the way back to biblical times.
It appears to me that one can make a good case that there's nothing new about flying saucers. Earthlings have observed strange things flying in the sky that weren't birds. After all, before we were flying airplanes or balloons, what else was flying in the sky besides birds?
The history of this thing seems to go back, if not hundreds, thousands of years. We have portraits painted back in the 1400s and 1300s, and before that, Japanese wood carvings and so on, depicting these things. And I don't know, it's pretty hard to blow it off when you see these things, and they look pretty much the same as what everybody's reporting now. Did they know something we didn't know back then, or did they assume something we don't assume now?
Of all the artistic portrayals of what may be UFOs from the pre-1947 era, perhaps the most important can be found in a wood carving of an incident that occurred in 1561 in Nuremberg, Germany. At dawn on April 14, 1561, the skies over Nuremberg were reportedly filled with a multitude of objects, seemingly engaged in an aerial battle. Small spheres and disks were said to emerge from large cylinders. The objects were described in the Nuremberg Gazette as behaving in much the same way as some modern UFO reports, in that some of the objects would emerge from a larger object, or, as we might call it today, a mothership. But if these objects have been seen and recorded since antiquity, why have they become so much more prevalent in modern times? Stanton Friedman offers a theory.
Everybody in the neighborhood is concerned about their own survival and security. That means keeping tabs on the primitives in the neighborhood. And since they all know that things change with time, thinking beings have a habit of learning how to do things better and differently, you check them out every once in a while, but only closely once they show signs of being able to bother you. Boy, the end of World War II was certainly such a time. Evidence of nuclear weapon explosions, rockets being fired, and powerful electronics, radar systems and all that sort of stuff. So suddenly, it became incumbent upon the powers that be in the local neighborhood to check us out. Make sure we don't take our brand of friendship out there.
Probably the only unexplained astronaut UFO case on record is the Skylab 3 case from September 20th, 1973. In this case, 3 astronauts, Alan Bean, Jack Lausma, and the first scientist in space, Dr. Owen K. Garriott of Stanford University, sighted a bright red, flashing object outside their spacecraft. They observed it for 10 minutes and took 4 color photographs. Dr. Garriott measured the delay between when Skylab 3 went into the Earth's shadow and when the UFO went into the shadow. This gave him a distance measurement which showed the object to be between 25 and 30 miles away and over 800 feet in diameter.
Now that is extraordinary. No one has ever orbited an object over 1,000 feet in size in space. In fact, at that time in 1973, the Skylab itself was the largest object ever put in orbit.
I've spoken with a number of astronauts, and if you remember what the original requirements were, they had to be the best of the best. They all had to be pilots, for one thing. And pilots are familiar with things in the atmosphere. They don't live very long if they're not. So yes, I'm very impressed with astronauts. Are they 100% perfect about everything? Of course not, but that isn't the question. Are they as dependable as anybody else? I'd say yes, more so than most.
What makes this a great case is that you have the highest caliber of witnesses imaginable. You have photographic data, you have optical ranging data, and you have size data from a combination of all that. There's nothing like it in history.
One of the hallmarks of a best evidence UFO case is one where there are multiple independent witnesses who all observe the same thing. On December 11, 1996, in 3 separate areas along the Klondike Highway in Canada's Yukon Territory, dozens of witnesses observed a massive UFO that has been estimated to have been almost a mile in length.
The Yukon case is emblematic of what a good case should be. I mean, sure, we'd like to have a piece of the craft. We'd like to have the crew member introduced for dinner, but multiple independent witnesses lasting a long time describing something that's way outside the norm. There's no way you can make it into a 747, for example. And big, but this was much, much bigger than a 747.
The first sightings occurred at approximately 8:30 p.m. at Fox Lake, where 6 witnesses reported seeing a huge UFO moving slowly across the frozen lake. They described a smooth and solid object that did not make any noise. Less than half an hour later, in the village of Pelly Crossing, a 2-hour drive north of Fox Lake, other groups of witnesses observed the same UFO. Shortly thereafter, in the village of Carmax, 4 men in a truck and a family of 5 through their living room window also sighted the UFO. What did all of these witnesses see that cold December night in 1996? How could a UFO be so large? Stanton Friedman has a theory.
I like it partly because I've often talked about you'd use a very large vehicle to go between the stars and small Earth excursion modules to flit around down in the atmosphere where you've got big gravity, high pressure, all the other things. So I like the case. It's got a lot of data, careful investigation, just a top-notch example of good UFO story.
Did dozens of people in Canada's Yukon Territory see an extraterrestrial version of an aircraft carrier in December 1996? 10 years later, after thorough investigation, all that can really be said was that they saw a flying object that remains unidentified. Perhaps no UFO case is more worrying than one which appears to compromise national security, and there are few places more secure than a nuclear missile launch site, like the one near Malmstrom, Montana, at which Captain Robert Salas was stationed one morning in March 1967.
Early in the morning, and I get a call from the topside flight security controller or guard, and he said that few of the guards had been seeing some strange lights flying around in very strange ways, making very rapid movements, stopping, making very sharp turns. So I just kind of discounted it and basically hung up on him. And he calls back about 5 minutes later. This time he's very agitated. He's yelling into the phone, screaming. Sir, there's a large red glowing object that's hovering right outside the front gate.
Lieutenant Salas ordered the guards to secure the perimeter, and he went to inform his commander. At this point, the warning lights in the control center went off, and the missiles shut down, one after another. What made this event even stranger, if that's possible, was the fact that the exact same thing had happened 1 week earlier at Echo Flight, approximately 25 miles away. A lengthy investigation was conducted, but no positive cause for the shutdowns was ever found, despite extensive and concentrated effort.
Missile officers are highly trained, engineering and science types for the most part. And the air police, these people go through special security schools. They have secret clearances, that sort of thing. They carry weapons. They're highly trained people. So I think it's very significant when people of this caliber make sightings. The tragedy is that we don't know all the details of the reports. They've been kept secret.
I was there for another 2 years at Maelstrom. This incident was never brought up again in any of our briefings, and we were told not to talk to anybody about it. Over the years, it became more and more clear to me that what occurred was something that can't be explained as originating from Earth.
I'm quite impressed with the Malmstrom case, not only because of the people involved, and there were quite a few people involved. It wasn't just a flyover by a flying saucer, oh, what went by. But the impact on the equipment that was there, I mean, it's kind of scary when you think of missiles being affected by a foreign power, if you will. And remember, it's one of a number of cases around SAC bases. There was a whole wave of sightings.
Indeed, over the past 60 years, there have been dozens of sightings in and around sensitive nuclear facilities. At least one person who was there is certain that there was a purpose.
I'm convinced that we were visited by some extraterrestrial object, and that there was not only visited, but there was a definite message. And the message was, get rid of your nuclear weapons.
One of the most extraordinary UFO encounters of the 20th century occurred in the tiny fishing community of Shag Harbor on the southern tip of Nova Scotia. On the evening of October 4th, 1967, several residents of the village noticed a rather strange grouping of 4 orange lights. A number of witnesses watched these lights flash in sequence for several minutes, and then suddenly and rapidly dive in a sharp 45-degree angle toward the water's surface. On hitting the water's surface, the lights did not immediately disappear, but seemed to float on the surface approximately 1/2 mile from the shore. Several reports to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police prompted 3 officers to investigate. Their reports indicate that they observed what the witnesses had: orange lights floating on the water. The officers, along with dozens of witnesses who had gathered on the shore, watched as the orange light slowly changed to yellow, and the dome-shaped object appeared to move slowly across the surface of the water, leaving a yellowish foam in its wake. After about 5 minutes, the object submerged beneath the water. The military was called in to investigate. Years later, UFO researchers Don Ledger and Chris Stiles uncovered the fact that the object that dove into the waters off Shag Harbor had been tracked. It had actually traveled underwater for a distance of about 25 miles to a place called Government Point. where the United States maintained a technically advanced military base for tracking submarines. At this point, the United States Navy also became involved in the investigation. As the Navy waited, the detection equipment picked up another object entering the area underwater. It joined the first object on the ocean floor. For nearly a week, the Navy vessels held their position over the UFOs, until the UFOs began to move towards the Gulf of Maine. The objects distanced themselves from the ships that pursued them, and then broke to the surface and shot skyward, where they vanished within seconds.
What's different about the Shag Harbor incident, or the UFO incident, is that the witnesses, the lay people, claimed they saw an airplane or crashing into the harbor. They thought it was an airplane, and it was the military who classified it as a UFO. Usually it's the other way around, people. The lay people call it in and say they saw a UFO, and the military will say it's, it's just misinterpretation of a prosaic object in the sky. It could be an airplane or a planet or a star or something like that, or a satellite. So this was different. It was completely switched around from the usual concept.
The Shag Harbor incident occurred over water and then underwater. As the old saying goes, the oceans of the world hide a lot of history and a lot of mystery. The difference with Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, is that in 1967, the waters there may well have held a mystery that was literally out of this world. It's a history that the Canadian and American governments still keep secret 40 years later. Kelly Johnson was the world's leading aircraft designer of his time, and at the time of his sighting, he was in the process of designing the U-2 spy plane for the Central Intelligence Agency. Johnson was on the ground with his wife in Agoura, California, when, unbeknownst to him, a crew of his top flight test engineers and his chief aerodynamicist were aboard a Lockheed WV-2 aircraft flying over Long Beach, and they saw the same object at the same time from a different angle. These different angles allowed researchers to triangulate the location of the object with precision. The aircraft was flying to the northwest. Kelly Johnson and his wife were looking due west. For 6 to 7 minutes, these two groups of observers saw a 200-foot-long, black, flying wing-shaped object hovering motionless over Santa Barbara Channel off the south coast of California. This object was at an altitude of roughly 15,000 feet. The aircraft flew directly towards it to see if they could get closer and get a better view. Meanwhile, Johnson started to observe the object with his binoculars, and he was able to see the object take off at high speed out over the Pacific, while his crew also observed the same thing from their different location. The object accelerated at about 130 Gs to 90 miles altitude until it disappeared. In his official report, Kelly Johnson stated, quote, "I am now more firmly convinced than ever that such devices exist, and I have some highly technical converts in this belief."
If there's one guy who ought to know what was flying around the country at that time, it would be Kelly Johnson. And he was certainly in a position to evaluate what he was seeing. And when he talks to somebody else, another one of his trusted people, and they saw the same thing, I don't see how anybody can throw that out. We're not talking about a 2-second observation at 3 a.m. by the town drunk. We're talking about Kelly Johnson at the top of the aerospace design business.
The United States Air Force concluded that Johnson and his crew had seen a lenticular cloud. Despite the nature of the sighting, the quality of the witnesses, and the fact that the witnesses themselves specifically considered and ruled out that explanation. You would think that the government would perhaps reconsider its employment of a man who could not tell a lenticular cloud from a structured aircraft. But Kelly Johnson continued designing the most advanced and secret aircraft in the world for decades to come, none of which could move like the one he saw on December 16, 1953. In the search for top UFO cases, skeptics will often ask why there aren't better UFO photos available. In fact, there are UFO photos out there that have withstood expert analysis, the best of which come from McMinnville, Oregon, taken on May 11, 1950, by farmer Paul Trent.
By analyzing the two photos, it was possible to determine where he stood, where Mr. Trent stood when he took the two photos, to within accuracy of a foot or so. And so if you imagine looking down from above, you can plot where he was standing and where the sighting lines went out. They said that this object moved to the left, moved southward as they're looking towards the west. It moved slightly between pictures. And in fact, he was standing in one location for the first photo, looking, let's say, this way, and then he moved a little bit to the north. As this object was traveling along, he didn't want it to get blocked by the nearby garage, so he moved a little bit to his right, and then he looked and took a photo that was in this way, and the sighting lines crossed. Now the overhead wires can be positioned where they were, and the sighting lines did not cross under the wires. So, if it was a model, it wasn't hanging straight down under the wire.
The two photographs taken by Paul Trent provided a stereoscopic pair of pictures that gave researchers the data necessary to determine and measure distances to objects within a short range of the camera.
His altitude, or the altitude of the camera, also dropped by about a foot. So not only do you have a horizontal triangulation method, but you have a vertical triangulation method. Now when you combine those two methods of distance determination, you can determine the distance to every short-range object in those photos. And the UFO model, if that's what it was, does not fit. It is not at the close range of those overhead wires that are about 15 feet away from the camera. They don't fit the locations and distance of the garage or the house, or the trees that were several hundred feet away in the background.
There's no indication that that this was a hoax. That the indications are totally that they actually saw some object flying past their farm and took two photographs of it.
In the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force contracted an outside scientific study of UFOs to be conducted by the University of Colorado. The astronomer William Hartman concluded that this is one of the few cases in which all of the geometric, photometric, and photogrammetric aspects agreed that there was an object, extraordinary object, tens of meters in size and metallic in appearance, about a mile away, which would seem to be consistent with an alien visitation, even though that's pretty hard to believe.
Hard to believe? Perhaps. But in the McMinnville case, it's hard to escape the conclusion that a picture really is worth 1,000 words. One of the best documented and most famous encounters by military personnel with a UFO occurred between December 26 and December 28, 1980, in Rendlesham Forest in the United Kingdom, near two air bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, which were at the time leased to the United States Air Force. At approximately 3 a.m. on the 26th, a U.S. Air Force security patrol observed strange lights above the forest. A 3-man security unit was dispatched from Bentwaters to investigate. all three men closed in on an object that resembled an aircraft on fire. The senior NCO, Sergeant Jim Peniston, claimed that he got close enough to see a structured object. There was then a silent explosion of light, and the object disappeared in a blur towards the coast. The following evening, strange lights were again seen in the forest. The deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, took a squad out to investigate. What he saw that night continues to defy explanation.
It appeared to be like an eye. That's the best way I can describe it. Had a dark center and appeared to be dripping something molten, as though it were something pouring from like steel from a crucible. The object came even closer. It moved through the trees, going horizontal, up and down a little bit as it went. We were really in awe at this time. So we tried to get closer. We moved toward the object itself. The object receded out into the field. We watched it there in the field for a few minutes, and then it very silently exploded and broke into, I believe it was 5 white spheres, small spheres, and they just disappeared. While we're standing there in awe, one of the party members looks up and says, "Look in the sky." We looked up, and there to the north were several objects, 3 objects that were elliptical, and they had multi-colors. They were moving at high speed, at sharp angular movements, as though they were doing a grid search or something. I really can't say what for sure, but they were moving about quite rapidly. We noticed to the south there were several objects there. One particular one approached us at very, very high speed, probably 3,000 to 4,000 feet high, maybe a little more. Stopped almost directly overhead and sent a beam down to our feet. The interesting thing about the beam was the beam didn't radiate out. It was a steady beam, about 10, 12 inches in diameter. Not like a flashlight beam that spreads out as it goes. So obviously it wasn't a normal light beam, something more like a laser. We stood there in awe, quite concerned. Well, was it signaling us, warning us, trying to injure us? We really weren't sure what it was trying to do, but we were really concerned at that point. And just as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared.
Rendlesham is Britain's best-known UFO incident. Arguably, it's one of the world's most important UFO cases. What makes it so important is that everything that makes a UFO case good happened here all at once. Firstly, you had an incident which happened over a series of different nights, so it's not just a one-off. Secondly, the witnesses, most of them were military, so you've got trained observers. Thirdly, you've got trace evidence, and this is absolutely critical. The UFO landed. Markings were found in the forest floor, where this thing had come down on a tripod-like device. And critically, when the base personnel checked this area with a Geiger counter, the radiation readings were assessed by the Defence Intelligence staff at the Ministry of Defence as being significantly higher than background.
It's just a very solid case in terms of all kinds of physical evidence, highly trained, reputable witnesses, everything you would want, except once again it's been muddied up. And once again, somebody in the government is lying about it and distorting the picture and hiding the truth.
In the quarter century since the Rendlesham case occurred, Charles Halt, who retired from the U.S. Air Force as a colonel, has come to the same conclusion, that there is much more to this case than meets the eye.
Several years later, I started running into people that were involved that I didn't realize were on the edge or had picked up bits and pieces from here. For instance, one of the radar operators in the tower at Eastern Radar, who had air defense responsibility for that sector, told me that they actually picked up objects on the screen that night and had them on tape, but somebody took the tape. Then a couple of the young troops came forward and said, after the incident, that the 3 people that were involved that went out and approached the craft were taken into a room and pumped full of drugs and hypnotized and debriefed, so to speak. And then I found out a mysterious C-141 landed soon thereafter with an unusual crew and all sorts of things. The aftermath is quite interesting. It was very obvious there was a great deal more interest than was ever publicly or openly admitted to anybody, including the senior officers on the base.
To this day, No one knows for sure what happened in Rendlesham Forest between December 26th and December 28th, 1980. But one thing seems certain. Whatever these Air Force personnel saw on those nights was something more mysterious and perhaps otherworldly than the government would like us, and even them, to believe. At about 12:30 a.m. on September 19th, 1976, the Imperial Iranian Air Force command post at Tehran received several telephone reports from citizens of strange lights in the sky. The command post contacted General Nader Yousefi, Assistant Deputy Commander of Operations. General Yousefi took a look for himself and saw a very bright object, larger than a star. At that point, he decided to scramble one F-4 Phantom jet from Cherokee Air Force Base in Hamadan.
Everybody was worried about incursions by the Soviets flying aircraft over non-Soviet territories. So they had considered the possibility that this might be some incursion by the Soviets, but when they saw this multiple flashing light stuff going on, it made no sense to imagine that it would be the Soviets trying to covertly fly over Iran for whatever reason.
You don't scramble if you're not worried. And once you've established it's not a Soviet airplane or something like that, why do you keep chasing?
At 0130 hours, the F-4 took off and proceeded to a point 40 nautical miles north of Tehran. It was noted that the object was of such brilliance that it could be seen up to 70 miles away. When the F-4 came to within about 25 nautical miles of the object, the jet suddenly lost all instrumentation and communications. The pilot broke off the intercept and turned away. When the F-4 had turned back towards its airbase, the aircraft regained instrumentation and communication. At 0140 hours, a second F-4 was scrambled. Closing on the object at 150 nautical miles per hour and at a range of 25 nautical miles, the object began to move, keeping a steady distance of 25 nautical miles from the F-4.
The pilot described the object as being flashing colors. It had some size to it, but he couldn't really see a size or shape because it was so bright, but it was flashing multiple colors at a high rate of speed. They all blurred together, he said. Certainly something unlike what we would expect to be in the skies anywhere, to say nothing of over Tehran.
While the object and the F-4 continued on a southerly path, a smaller, second object detached itself from the first and advanced on the F-4 at a high rate of speed. The pilot, believing he was under attack, tried to launch a Sidewinder missile, but he suddenly lost all instrumentation, including weapons control, and all communication. The F-4 pilot then took evasive action. The object fell in behind him at about 4 nautical miles distance for a short time, then turned and rejoined the primary object. The main object then flew away at several times the speed of sound. Once again, as soon as the F-4 had turned away, instrumentation and communications were regained.
The fact that anybody can cause sophisticated military aircraft to lose important systems at their whim, because the systems came back on, 2 different airplanes after all, that's scary. Because Iran was a close ally of the United States at that time, the Americans were called in and they helped in the investigation. The Defense Intelligence Agency report that was filed because of that investigation went to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of State, the White House. It was clearly considered important.
The DIA report concluded the value of this information was high, timely, and of major significance. quote, "This case is a classic which meets all the criteria necessary for a valid study of the UFO phenomenon." The best evidence UFO case of all time occurred on the 17th of July, 1957, when a United States Air Force spy plane had a close encounter with an unidentified flying object. The 6-man crew of an RB-47 aircraft, which was equipped with state-of-the-art electronic countermeasures equipment, including 3 electronic intelligence stations manned by highly trained Air Force personnel known as Ravens or Crows, were literally tailgated by an object that continues to defy explanation to this day.
This plane was flying out of Forbes Air Force Base, Kansas, and the crew was on a training mission to shake down the airplane and test out its components. This crew detected and recorded on wire recorders and tape recorders the electronic signals, radar-like in nature, that came from the same direction and location as the UFO. It followed them and then overtook them as they flew over Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Oklahoma for over 2 hours that night.
The crew involved in the UFO incident was one of the top crews in the wing. They were instructors and evaluators in the standardization division and were highly respected. They had the most experience and the best training. The aircraft commander, in fact, Lou Chase, he made a landing. After takeoff, one of the outboard engines froze up and broke the wing off there, and he brought the aircraft back in to test his skill and as a pilot. In the back end, the 3 crows back there were the most experienced, and they trained all of the new crows coming into the wing. Provenzano and McClure trained me when I came in, as a matter of fact. Eventually, these guys were not on the same crew because they had so much experience and knowledge that they were put on separate crews and became 3 instructors and evaluators within the wing.
As the RB-47 moved over Texas, a brightly lighted object appeared and began to follow the aircraft. Major Chase contacted Radar Station Utah at Duncanville, Texas, which confirmed that their radar had also detected the UFO.
You have a very experienced crew of a very sophisticated airplane having something very strange happen. They see it, they pick it up on their electronics, the whole crew is involved, ground radar is involved, it lasted for a long time. What more can you ask for?
The UFO continued to play tag with the RB-47, which had left its scheduled flight path to pursue the object, until the aircraft began to run low on fuel and turned to head home. The UFO followed the aircraft until the signal finally faded as the crew approached Oklahoma City. In his report on the incident, the Director of Intelligence of the 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing stated that he had, quote, "No doubt the electronic signals coincided exactly with visual observations by aircraft commander numerous times, thus indicating positively the object being the signal source." End quote. The Air Force, via Project Blue Book, without any real investigation, concluded that the sightings in northern Texas were an ordinary jetliner. In doing so, they failed to explain the ongoing nature of the incident over several states, the appearance and disappearance of the object, both visually and on radar and electronic countermeasures equipment, and how exactly the Utah radar station failed to distinguish between an airliner that was 600 miles away from the RB-47 and a UFO. Researcher Brad Sparks explains why the RB-47 case is the best ever, contrary to what the United States Air Force said.
Why is it so important? Because it's the only time in history that radio or radar signals have been detected and recorded from a UFO, not just are using radars to bounce signals off a UFO. We're actually detecting something that the UFO seems to be sending out.
This indication of intelligence makes the Blue Book explanation even more absurd, as does the fact that this was not the only time an RB-47 encountered a UFO. Colonel Bruce Bailey recounts his own similar incident.
We were flying a Common Cause mission. This was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we flew a mission every day to go down and take a good close look at Cuba and to identify any site that should fire on the U-2 or any other U.S. vessel or aircraft. And on this mission, we would fly down to New Orleans and hit a tanker right over the Gulf of Mexico out of New Orleans, get filled up with fuel, and then head on to Cuba. Well, on this mission, shortly after completing our air refueling, we had some aircraft or something come up, bright light, and intercept us, and ground control was tracking it. They could copy it too. And it wasn't with us that long, probably a total of 10 minutes, but that was broken in the middle with a gap of about 2 minutes when it went away. The difference in our experiences than the other crew was our equipment in the back end. All we got was noise. It just wiped us out. We didn't get any intelligible signals at all.
When asked what it was that they encountered over the Gulf of Mexico, Colonel Bailey, a decorated Air Force veteran, can only offer the same conclusion reached by Major Chase and his crew 5 years earlier.
Unidentified flying object is what would explain it, I guess, because the crew up front could see it. We had no windows in the control compartment. We couldn't see anything. But they could see it, and what they saw jived with what ground control was reporting, and the navigator could also track it on his radar. And it all tied together. There was something there, and it had a capability far greater than anything we could do. In the incident that you're talking about, as well as the incident with my crew, the follow-on was pretty much the same. You had a very thorough debriefing, and in that debriefing you were assured that you didn't see anything, you didn't hear anything, you didn't do anything, and that you would not say anything about it. I've heard of other crews and such running into similar treatment after they reported a UFO, and it got to the point that sometimes you would see something that would actually be a UFO, meaning it's unidentified, but you wouldn't say anything about it, because if you started harping or talking about a UFO incident, that was a good way to end a military career.
Apparently, as far as the United States Air Force was concerned, when its top crews, who were charged with protecting the security of the nation in the midst of the Cold War, and who often came face to face with the enemy, saw something like this, they were really just mistaking it for a civilian airliner. If that was true, any sensible Air Force should have grounded those crews immediately. But instead, they kept on flying, so long as they stayed quiet about what they really saw in the skies above us. When one examines the best evidence UFO cases of all time, it becomes clear that the UFO phenomenon is worldwide in scope. The 10 best cases you have just seen come from Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Iran. But if this had been a top 20 list, you would also have seen cases from Brazil, Australia, Japan, New Guinea, France, and New Zealand. This body of evidence compels us to ask the following questions. What should be done about the UFO phenomenon? And what does it all mean? For an answer, we turn to author and researcher Mac Tonnies, who hails from Independence, Missouri. The conclusion that Tonnies has reached is simple but profound. We don't know what UFOs are, but the scientific community should be trying harder than it is to find out.
whatever UFOs might ultimately prove to be, and we might never find out, it seems to me that they are definitely worth scientific consideration, if for no other reason than they affect how we think and how we perceive our universe. They apparently have been recurring throughout time, and they have infringed upon our belief systems to the point where we now think of the alien as something very specific. And if for no other reason than understanding how our mind reacts to the presence of a possible other in our midst, I think it's imperative that we understand UFOs and what they are. If, on the other hand, they are physical objects or paraphysical objects, which might be the case, and I don't think we have a proper vocabulary for that yet, frankly, I think that it's doubly important that we understand what these things are. Because if they're real, if they're craft of some sort, if they're disinformation devices, then it seems to me that what they are doing is influencing the way we think, influencing our mythologies and our collective way of knowing ourselves. And I think that's a pretty sacred thing to be messing with. And it would certainly behoove us to understand what we're dealing with.
In every documentary, a filmmaker asks 5 questions: who, what, where, when, and why. In this film, the what is the controversial phenomenon known as animal mutilation, wherein healthy animals, usually but not always cattle, have been found dead, killed in what seems to many to be a grotesque, paranormal, otherworldly manner. In terms of the when and the where, the film was shot in 2005 in northern Alberta, Canada. Although, as you will see, the phenomenon has been around for decades throughout the world. As for the who, that would be this man, retired cattle rancher Fern Belzil. He's been investigating animal mutilations for over a decade now. Finally, as for the why, I prefer to leave that to the viewer. Watch and decide for yourself what's really behind the feels of fear.
These here were all stalls for horses. My dad's, they had 2 horses per stall, 2 over there and 2 on the other side. And over here was a single stall for the saddle horse. And there was a step to go upstairs, and had the milk cows on this side, and the corrals for the calves as we weaned them. And this here is stanchions for the calves. We'd open this up like this, and the calves would put their head in, and we'd pail feed them. And they get used to that. Or else just one calf, one individual calf at a time, whatever. That's a BD product. There was a handle here to open them. It was a handy setup. When we had worked up a reasonable sized herd, we started going to bull sales in Edmonton, Calgary, and other different areas, smaller communities, and we were fortunate enough to win a few grand championships in Calgary and Edmonton especially. We went by freight train, and we load the cattle in these boxcars, and we stayed with the cattle all the way to Toronto. We'd build a deck above the animals and kept our feed up there, and we always had to bring some food for ourselves. And we made sure that we kept the side door of the boxcar open by about a foot, nailed it down with a 2x6, and let a rope drop out. In case we got out of the train at the divisional points, we used to run out of the train and go to the confectionaires to buy us something to eat or a treat of some kind. And then if the train was moving, if you had a rope outside your boxcar, there was a chance to grab it and get back in the car. I've always been lucky. I didn't have any problems, but we had a couple guys that did miss their train and had to grab the rope and jump in.
Fern Belzile obviously knows what he's talking about when it comes to cattle. As he's shown since he was a young man, he's also something of an iconoclast, brutally honest, unafraid to challenge authority, and unafraid to tell people when he thinks they're wrong.
Towards the very end of my hockey career, we walked 2 miles south of the farm here with my neighbor who was playing with us, and there were 2 cars leaving St. Paul to go to this place called Smoky Lake to play hockey, and one car was supposed to pick us up, but there was a mix-up, and neither car picked us up. So my neighbor said, "My dad's a real good friend of the sergeant RCMP in St. Paul." He said, "We'll phone him." So we walked over to the closest farm, and we phoned him, and the RCMP, the sergeant, he sent the car, and it brought us to Smoky Lake, which was 50 miles away. And he drove us there, which was quite a thing. And when we got there, the first period was over, and I was kind of cheesed off. And so I went to the coach, and I started telling him, I said, "What are you guys doing? You know, how come you didn't pick us up?" And just the usual stuff. And so he was upset with me, and so he quit.
What I take from that story is you're not a guy who has a problem telling someone they've made a mistake.
No.
A person's home often has a profound influence on their life. In Fern Belzile's case, that home lies in the Canadian West, a vast region that even today, opened up as it's been by roads, railways, and air travel, can still sometimes feel as isolated as it was in the early days of exploration and settlement. In a region such as this, one's community has always been important. In order to foster that sense of community, towns often adopt symbols. In Glendon, Alberta, for example, where Fern has investigated animal mutilation cases, the town has adopted a giant pierogi as its tasty symbol. In Murnum, Alberta, another community where there have been animal mutilation cases, the town's strong religious roots have led it to adopt the dove of peace as its symbol. Which leads us to Fern's hometown of St. Paul, Alberta, where the community has adopted a symbol that is literally out of this world. A symbol that led directly to Fern's involvement in the animal mutilation mystery.
Well, the UFO landing pad was a centennial project, Canada's 100th birthday, which was in 1967. A group of energetic volunteers wanted to build something that the world would remember the town of St. Paul for. So they basically decided to build the world's first UFO landing pad, and they stressed that part. And they wanted to make this, where the landing pad was, independent from the municipality of St. Paul. So the municipality of St. Paul basically gave up the land that's under the UFO landing pad.
The message, the underlying message with the landing pad was that St. Paul is such a friendly community that we invite people from all over this world and others to come and visit. And that was the underlying theme of it. And if any visitors that go tour the landing pad will see that it has been declared a republic, a free republic. And that again goes to show that the territory is really open to anyone and everyone. In 1993, we officially opened the first original Flying Saucer Tourist Information Center. I was the first full-time Chamber of Commerce manager to man in the position at that time. Part of the job in the Chamber of Commerce is to market your community and make it a great place for people to do business and live in. And so one of the promotions that we had tossed around at that time was to come up with a UFO sightings hotline. And it started off as a publicity stunt, and it was a publicity stunt that worked very, very well. And almost immediately we started getting phone calls from people that heard our interviews, because we were very adamant that all of the reports that we got, we didn't question or dispute or ask them what they were smoking or drinking when they gave us the reports. We simply wanted to document what people were telling us was authentic reports, and so that's what we did.
That's how I got into it. One day, Paul Peltier, who was the manager of the chamber, got a call from a guy from Saskatchewan that said that he needed help, that he'd had several cattle mutilated over the years, and asked if we would come out there. So I was a good friend of Paul, and I used to go to the office quite often with him, and I came in that same day. I happened to come in, and so he asked me if I would go with him to check this animal.
So Fern and I got in the car. We drove out to this ranch, about a 2.5-hour drive out of St. Paul into Saskatchewan. And wow, amazing! You have to see it with your own eyes too. You have to experience the mutilation to even fathom what. This is not normal. You know, this is not done.
I didn't know anything about it, but when I first saw it, I wasn't convinced right off the bat that this was authentic. And because it had been dead for right about a week, and there were incisions there too, but the coyotes had been eating at it. And when they start eating on it, you know, it destroys a lot of evidence. And but then when I was looking at this and I was taking pictures, and I got Paul and another fellow there to grab the cow by the legs and turn her over to her other side. And to my surprise, the hair was in a complete circle underneath what she was lying on, just as if she hit the ground and spun. So right there, then I decided this has got to be something different. It's an authentic mutilation. And ever since that, I've been looking closer and closer for anything abnormal, you know.
Fern's a private investigator. He's doing this voluntarily. Gets very little funding, you know, to help him with his research. But he's accumulated a tremendous wealth of information, and is starting to lecture quite a bit and share that information.
Now, I was at the conference. I just finished my presentation, and this lady walked up to me and she said, "I'd like to talk to you." So we went outside, and this is a cow's udder. And she found that in the corral, in their corral, and there was an indentation in the ground where they had fallen and made a bit of a hole in the ground. So it was dropped from the sky. She started telling me this, and they're talking about fear. She started to cry.
St. Paul has adopted unidentified flying objects and extraterrestrials as their symbol. But at heart, this is still cattle country. In a town where almost everyone knows something about cattle, Fern Belzil is well respected, and people listen to him when he talks, especially when he's talking about animal mutilations.
He has got quite a bit of experience over the past few years by going actually to cattle mutilations, but also coming up with a network almost internationally, working with other people. So he's become very well known. He's in demand. He travels both Canada and US, and we're very proud to have someone like him that knows the cattle industry very well and is willing to volunteer his time with the hope of sometimes explaining this unexplained phenomena of cattle mutilations.
I first heard about Fern shortly after I arrived here. I heard stories about cattle mutilations and that Fern was the man to go to. I met him on an event, and he mentioned I should come down to the farm one day and he'd show me one of his presentations. Still kind of skeptical about what he did at that point. But after spending more time with him, looking at some of the pictures, you get more sucked in and you want to become like an investigator, just like Fern. I want to find out just as much as he does. It's a big mystery and it draws you in. You want to be a part of it. So the more he tells me about it, the more I get interested in it.
Look at this incision. It's unbelievable. Now, something happened to this one that didn't happen to any other. And it's the first time I witnessed the teeth cut out. Usually they're just level with the skin. They're gone, but there's no incision like that.
He's just kind of one of the citizens of town. I don't think many people in town, certainly maybe because it's been going on so long, they don't seem to see him as any different than anybody else, and I suppose he's not different than anybody else. He just happens to have a sort of unusual hobby that's really taken him to a lot of places now, and it's, you know, it's clearly something a lot of people are taking seriously and should take seriously, because what he's got on film, it doesn't look like it's predators, so I mean, obviously there's something to look into there.
While the people of St. Paul might have a great deal of respect for Fern Belzile and his investigations, not everyone in Alberta is quite so supportive. Sometimes the road Fern travels in his quest for the truth about the animal mutilation phenomenon can seem long and lonely.
The government, the Alberta government, we've been trying to get some help from them. They have just simply refused us. Their excuse is that it's predators that's doing it, and they've consulted vets, not vets, but veterinarians, and they take the easy way out. They just say it's predators, and they have never seen my presentation. If they saw my presentation, they would hesitate before they say that. Now this is a bull calf. See how this is all cut out? Ear was gone. And the scrotum, and I got the fellows to lift the leg up, and that was completely round before they lifted the leg. The scrotum was gone. And this here is an important part here. This skin was gone here, and the same as what I'm going to show you several of. The flesh is untouched, and I have yet to find the skin that comes from there.
You ask for a veterinarian's help. Can't be bothered. You ask for a police force help. Can't be bothered. You know, you're chasing little green men. Yeah, right. You know, it's so they dismiss your attempted investigations so quickly.
A gentleman from Derwent, Alberta, was leasing pasture from the native reserve, and there's a native reserve right next to St. Bride's, and he was leasing the land, and this bull got mutilated.
They said to get a hold of Vern from St. Paul, so we phoned him up, and down he came, and he went from there on. He went right through.
Now, did you contact the police?
Yes, we contacted the RCMP.
And they suggested you call Fern?
Right.
And then you never heard from the police again?
No.
But they didn't want to investigate any further?
No.
They called me to sort of pass the buck, I guess, you know. They just say let Fern handle it, and well, they had the end of the story for them. I don't know what they're thinking of. I can't think for them, but so I don't know what their reasons are.
these animals, in many cases, are prized animals. They're expensive animals in the thousands of dollars. They're dead. Someone or something killed them, and nobody cares.
Well, we paid $4,000 for that bull that spring. We never had him insured, and we never got a penny back.
So it was a complete loss?
It was a complete loss.
I think when it comes to civilian or private investigators of the cattle mutilation mystery or the animal mutilation phenomenon in general, I think they kind of have a little bit of an advantage over the official world, in the sense that I can quite understand how at an official level it's played down. You know, don't cause hysteria, don't rock the boat, even if something unusual is taking place, you know, let's just keep it under wraps, so to speak. But I think, you know, for people who aren't tied to the official world and really don't have anything to lose, they're the people who can actually go out and do the field research and publish their findings without having to worry about the fact that, you know, their bosses are going to come down on them and so on.
Yeah, it happened right about up in here. She was laying right about here, and her head was facing to the north, with her legs facing south and spread, and her intestines were about 2 or 3 feet behind her, just over there.
Yeah, right in
here. Yeah.
Right in here. Even with me, I'm like you guys, I've raised cattle all my life, so, you know, I know what can happen. I've never had anything not even close to that. No incisions, you know, they die, and then coyotes come right away. And
oh, exactly, and they tear and rip and chew on stuff like this.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know the difference.
Oh, exactly,
yeah.
And that's right, yeah. No, definitely. And, but like I say, you know, people, they, you know, first thing is they'll say it's a predator kill, but, you know, I guess it gives them a peace of mind because they have an answer to something.
It's the easy way out.
Yeah.
I call that armchair quarterbacks.
That's what I have. And that's not the way it was laying when I found it.
The incisions on the other area, that little lamb, if you want to call it that, it was very much the same as cattle mutilations. Very neat and round little incision. That's what convinced me right there that this was an authentic mutilation.
If the animal mutilation phenomenon is real, as seems to be the case, this leaves us with one question. What is behind it all? Is it something relatively mundane, or is it caused by something truly paranormal?
I'd like to get my money for my bull, but
There's no way you can get that back, I guess.
well, the government, they say if it's false, like from there, they figured they'll give you the money, but we can't prove it.
So they'd give you the money if it fell from...
Right. If they figure it's aliens or something, they'll give you the money.
No.
But
well, what do you think of the...
I'm definitely.
So you think that...
Oh, definitely.
Many of the people whose animals have been mutilated are convinced that aliens are behind it. But what does Fern Belzil believe?
A lot of information that I have, it does appear like it could be aliens. Little theories that these cattle are picked up and brought into a ship, mutilated, and brought down in another area. And that's why we don't find blood, we don't find tracks. So do we have that kind of technology to do this type of stuff? And it just makes you think we don't know much about it in the true world. I guess that's why we go to aliens. We just take for granted that they have different technology than we have.
The alien aspect of it, I think, was always there, and people would look at the strangeness of the death and they could think of no other explanation for it. They'd look at the animal supposedly drained of blood. They would look at the so-called surgical precision of the wounds to the animals and say, well, this is obviously something doing it. It's something that is much more progressed, much more advanced than anything we have. Therefore, it must be aliens doing it.
No one knows more about the alleged extraterrestrial presence on Earth than nuclear physicist Stan Friedman.
At the end of World War II, there were 3 signs that soon these idiot Earthlings, this primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare, would be moving out. Soon meaning 100 years, which on a cosmic timescale is nothing. The 3 signs were clearly nuclear weapons. You measure the radiation in the atmosphere, it's easy to find. V-2 rockets, which obviously weren't being used to carry mail back and forth between Germany and England, and powerful electronics, radar systems in particular, which suddenly appeared on this planet. Used to be AM radio, which sticks around the planet, and now suddenly you've got radar beams that go outside. We're obviously moving along with development of electronic systems. I don't think it's any coincidence at all that the only place on the planet where you could check out all 3 of these technologies in 1947 and 48 was southeastern New Mexico.
It should come as no surprise that the state which gave us the Roswell incident, a UFO museum with a UFO Hall of Fame, gruesome stories of alien autopsies, and more crashed flying saucers than you can shake a stick at, was the state where the animal mutilation phenomenon became inextricably linked with extraterrestrials. It was a story that really took off in the mid-1970s.
A lot of the reports from that particular time were reported to the New Mexico State Police, and they collated literally dozens and dozens of files, a number very, very strange, with reports of weird pod marks found in the same vicinity of where the dead cattle were found, of blood drained from the animals, of what looked like surgical precision to open up the skin, organs removed, unmarked helicopters seen in the area, and even reports that in many cases the legs of the animals appear to become dislocated.
As ranchers and law enforcement started to notice this pattern of animals turning up dead on their property, they called upon the government. So the first person they called was Harrison Schmitt, who was at the time one of the senators from New Mexico. He was one of the former astronauts. So Senator Schmitt realized that this was indeed a problem that he'd better look into, so he actually called a conference to discuss the cattle mutilation phenomenon, get experts to come in, ranchers, and try and get a handle on what was going on. But they really couldn't come to a conclusion at the time as to what exactly was going on. There were a lot of testimony. They had cattle mutilation researchers, such as they were at the time. And the only quote I remember from that was from a researcher from Colorado, and his summary of the entire phenomenon was, the only sense of cattle mutilations is they make no sense at all.
A former FBI agent named Rommel was brought in to investigate animal mutilation, so he started at the very beginning looking at all of this stuff, investigating the number of cases, looking at the unusual aspects of it. Is there something that is different between an animal that has been mutilated and an animal that has died of natural causes and scavengers and predators have gotten to? And what he determined was that there was nothing unusual going on, that the ranchers reporting it, maybe the greatest people in the world, maybe the salt of the earth, but they just did not understand what happened when an animal died. He talked to the law enforcement that was involved investigating some of the mutilations. He talked to the UFO investigators. He talked to veterinarians, something that very few UFO investigators actually did. He talked to people at universities who had studied these sorts of things, so he could get a well-rounded picture of what was going on. And his conclusion, much to the chagrin of the UFO community, was there was nothing going on here. This was sort of a manufactured mystery, as we've seen in the past in other arenas.
That conclusion basically had the ranchers and farmers up in arms. You know, they were just absolutely convinced, having seen many of their cattle killed, that there was no way that this was purely the work of coyotes or something like that, or wild dogs. The surgical precision, the unmarked helicopters, the weird lights of the sky, organs removed, blood drained, and so on. You know, they just dismissed this particular idea, but nevertheless that was the theory that was embraced at the official level.
He said that these people didn't know what was going on, and it was rural hysteria, and, you know, kind of a slight on them. You know, apparently he thought he knew more about cattle ranching than people that have been doing it all their lives.
Look at this. You see the hair sticking outwards here and inward over here. Now that's just a perfect incision. If predators do that, I'll eat my shirt. There's just no way. You really got to look at this. It's really something. This is unbelievable, actually.
I think that the people listen to the ranchers because here's the guy who's in the field. He's been involved with the animal from its birth. As it grows up, he's watched it at every stage of its life. He's the guy who is right there. The people in the ivory towers, they show up later after the animal is dead. They're not that familiar with the situation. But the problem is the rancher, after the animal dies, no longer has an interest in it. It's dead. He'll bury it. The people who show up from the ivory towers are the people who understand the pathology of death. And when they look at the animal, they see there's nothing anomalous about it.
The calls that we were getting from these people, they were very serious, in tears. They had been laughed at by the police forces. They had been laughed at by the military. They had sought help everywhere. So we took them very seriously, and we went there with an open mind. When we got there, and you see the animal on the ground, like, wow, it just blows you away that how can this, this is not right.
We've gotten in touch with the government of agriculture and sent them a letter and asked them if they would consider helping me out, because a farmer loses an animal, you would think that it's it's worthwhile looking at.
I really don't know why nobody looks into it. Probably somebody should. Maybe we'll have to start because as I said, it's something that these farmers invest a lot of money in their cattle, and when they lose that kind of investment, obviously if it's not predators, and it clearly doesn't look to be predators, then it should be looked into.
These wounds, and you have to see them, some of these wounds are where the hide is missing, but the internal skin is undamaged. No one can do that. We need that help to be able to say what type of wound is it, and we know we have the forensic science to do that. We have that forensic science. Why is it not being taken seriously to get those scientific results? We're not asking for the little green man. We're asking for how did this animal die, and they do have the forensic science to come to that conclusion. But why don't they want to? Or if they do know, why aren't they sharing the information?
I think the reason why authority isn't taking cattle mutilation seriously is because they're stuck just like everybody else is. Nobody knows what it is. And to put time into that, Fern has devoted his entire life into finding out the answer, and there's still no answers. So I think they'd be just chasing a revolving door trying to find an answer. I don't think the authority believes they can actually find out what it's causing. I think it's a mystery, like ghosts, like, things like that. They just want to leave it in the shadow and not think about it.
Looking at some of the researchers, such as Fern Belzil in Canada, I embrace and endorse the research they're doing because they're at a grassroots level. They're not tied to an official body that maybe wants to go with one particular theory over another theory. And they're actually out in the field doing grassroots investigations, which I think if we're going to solve this particular mystery, we need to be out there. It's not something that can be done from the safety or the confines of an office, or by telephone. We need to be out there in the early hours of the morning, late at night, with state-of-the-art equipment, night scope equipment, night vision equipment, that sort of thing, in areas which are prevalent, if you like, to these particular types of attacks. And I think it's that way that we're going to get the answers, and it's those types of researchers that are going to find those answers.
As we've seen, Fern Belzil definitely knows cattle. He's raised and worked with them his entire life. He's also respected in his community as a hard-working man of integrity. But does that necessarily translate into the capabilities truly required to investigate the animal mutilation phenomenon. Is he qualified to differentiate in a scientific way between what is real and what is not?
There was an interesting thing that happened in the Northwest right after the atomic bomb tests in the Pacific Ocean. That their windscreens, their windshields were all being pitted by radiation, they thought. And you'd have hundreds of people reporting that their windshields had been pitted by the fallout from this radiation. The problem was, everybody looks through the windshield. Suddenly somebody says, well, my windshield was pitted by fallout. Everybody begins looking at their windshield, and what was the normal dust damage to a windshield as you drive at high speeds down the highway, they suddenly were noticed, and the conclusion they drew was, it has to be fallout. Now, any number of scientists could come in and explain to them exactly what was going on, but they believed that the fallout had damaged their windshield. It was something they had never seen before because they had not been looking for it. And I think one of the problems we run into in cattle mutilations is when you look at the dead animal, the ranchers had never been looking at the animal after it was dead. It's, where do I bury it? How do I dispose of the carcass? Now suddenly people are saying there's something unusual going on, and they began looking at the animals and seeing things that they don't remember having seen before, even though it was a natural part of the pathology of death.
Despite the claims by Fern and others that the authorities have not looked seriously at the animal mutilation phenomenon in Canada, the facts say otherwise. In an article in the Canadian Veterinary Journal in the late 1980s, 2 veterinary experts investigated the animal mutilation phenomenon. Like Ken Rommel in the United States, they came to the conclusion that the most logical explanation, and the one supported by all of the evidence, was that so-called animal mutilations are nothing more than the work of scavengers, feeding on animals that have already died of natural causes. This research and these conclusions are almost never referenced by the media.
Well, it boggles my mind. You see those incisions. There's no way, a predator can make a perfect circle like that with no blood. And even listening to the rancher talk about how all 80 of his cattle took off in the other direction and were scared. It really makes you wonder. You wonder if it must be something else.
I think the problem is the media are experts in nothing. They do not take the time to understand a phenomenon. They do not look at it in depth. They take the superficial look at it, they decide this is what it is, and they run with it from there. And I think that's the problem. The media doesn't understand this, but it's an interesting story. They can do it in a minute and a half, and they're off to the next one. They've got wonderful pictures of dead cows. They've got the local interest angle to run with, and they don't care any more about that story because they have another one to worry about tomorrow. This idea that alien beings cross interstellar distances and mutilate cattle is just absolutely ridiculous. And yet you can't convince people that it is ridiculous. When you look at the whole thing and you look at the study after study after study, you look at the Rommel report, you look at what's going on, the conclusion is absurd. It's easy. It's basically predators with some other little things thrown in.
That might satisfy scientists, but in a land of rodeos and cowboys, those explanations simply don't make sense to most people. They prefer to trust the hands-on expertise of someone who's worked with animals their entire life.
Absolutely, that's what it's all about. You have to know cattle very intimately. You have to know their habits and how they function. If you don't know that, then you would not qualify, in my estimation, to do this type of work. That's where he gets his credibility from, because if he didn't have that background, then there is no way he would have the credibility that his credibility is standing up to a lot of scrutiny, and nobody can question his credibility because it's there. It's, you know, you can only get it by way of experience and many years of being in the business. So it's a unique qualification, I guess.
And just a shot to show you the type of cattle that I was raising, more or less to prove to you that I am who I say I am. And this is the best 5 bulls at the Calgary Bull Sale, and won the best 2, the best 3, and the best 5, and the Grand Champion Bull.
There was a case in Arkansas where the body of a cow, freshly dead cow, was found, and 2 state troopers were assigned to watch this animal to see what happened to it as it decomposed naturally. So we know there weren't crazy cultists, we know there weren't UFOs, we know that there were predators, we know that it underwent the sort of changes you would see as the animal decomposed. And what they saw was the sort of injuries to this animal as it decomposed matched those of the animals that supposedly were mutilated.
Despite the official explanation, Fern Belzil remains convinced that there is more to the animal mutilation phenomenon than just the work of scavengers.
Well, as far as predators mutilating cattle, I don't know of any cases where predators mutilated any cattle. They might mutilate them after they're dead. They might chew away at them, and you could call that mutilation, I guess. The incisions are not taken by the mouth of done by the mouth of a predator. It looks like a laser cut, and the flesh is untouched. If it was a coyote, and say for instance he did take the skin, there's no scratches on the stomach at all, on the flesh at all, of anything that was eaten at it. So that's good enough for me. You know, if there's whenever it is predators that eat on them, it's not hard to tell.
Scientists and sheriff's deputies aren't the only ones who can conduct experiments. When opportunity presented itself, Fern decided to put the scavenger theory to the test himself.
I was coming back from Edmonton one day and with my truck, and about 30 miles east of Edmonton, there was a deer, a roadkill, and they had been just killed. It was still fresh. So I decided to back up. I had something in my head that I was wanting to do. I wanted to try an experiment. And it was funny because when my wife saw this, she said, "You're crazy. What are you doing?" Anyway, I had a piece of land not far from a gas well, just close to my place, half a mile from the farm. I unloaded the deer there right by a clump of bush and by a little hill, and right the first day, the ravens and the crows were pecking away at the rectum area. After 5 days, when I got there, and sure as heck, the predators had been at it. So I took pictures of all of that, and the difference between what a predator does and a true mutilation. What happened in a true mutilation, there's no comparison. So it really worked. You know, I even convinced myself.
For many people in St. Paul, Fern Belzil has made his case for the paranormal explanation of the animal mutilation phenomenon.
I saw something about how many cows being killed in one strike of lightning. I don't think it was lightning. I think it was probably UFO. Because something like that just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. It's kind of weird now.
I think you got 2 kinds of people in the area. Some are skeptics, and some believe that something is happening out there. And we don't feel that cattle mutilation is only happening in the community of St. Paul. We feel that maybe because we have someone that has taken interest in it, we probably get a little more publicity. But I would think cattle mutilation is happening right across Canada and right across the United States and internationally as well. And but I know there's many people that don't believe that something like this could happen. But I think you can't rule it out what it is. And I know we've ruled out a number of things, but I think on every case, and Fern Belzile takes this very serious. He looks at each case on its own merit.
I think the fact that he's a cattle rancher, a former cattle rancher, knows exactly what he's talking about, exactly what he's doing, you know, ratchets him up a notch with regard to listening to him and believing what he said. He refuses to say it's really anything except aliens, but won't actually come out and say it. And maybe he's saying that just because as soon as that comes out of his mouth, he knows he's going to lose, you know, 75% of his audience. And maybe he's doing something very intelligent and clever. He's leaving it open for people to say, it sounds like he's saying that it has to do with UFOs and aliens, but he's not coming out and saying it.
Theories on cattle mutilations, satanic cults, predators, coyotes, wolves, and bears, conspiracy theories, oil companies, government, and UFO connection. Now, I'm not here to convince anybody one way or the other. I have to admit, I don't know who's doing these mutilations. However, I don't believe it's predators.
That approach seems to be designed to get people interested but not afraid of what he's saying, even though he's, like you said, he's basically saying there's no other explanation except the extraterrestrials. But he doesn't come right out and say it. So like I said, that gives people some kind of a moral, social out, where they don't have to say, well, listen to this guy. And then somebody else will say, well, he's just another one of those UFO nuts. He's trying not to present himself as that kind of person, and I think that's intelligent. Whether I agree with his conclusion or not, I think that's probably one of the few intelligent ways to go about presenting the subject to people.
Well, your title, The Field of Fears, I know of a gentleman that thought that that wasn't too appropriate, but I like it because I think it fits us perfectly, and because I know of a lot of ranchers and that are scared of what's going on, and they had a cow mutilated and in the field most of the time at night, and they don't know what's going on. Someday we'll find some answers. We'll keep on trying. Maybe someday we'll find and we'll see something. We might not like what we see, but we're bound to see something.